This conference will now be recorded.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to session number 25 of Brothers in Arms, Proverbs 17:17. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. It's our theme verse. And today is July the 1st when we're recording this. So normally this would be session 26, so exactly halfway through 52 sessions. But we were at church camp last week, and so we did not do session 25. So you'll see session 26 coming up a few days after this one. But that would normally be today, session 26. But we're playing a little bit of a catch up, and we knew that would happen some through the year. But that's neither here nor there because you may not be watching this for a few weeks. And so the dates and the day and so forth, session number doesn't really matter to you if you're not uh, watching it soon after it's recorded. So in session 25, the week's Bible readings for Liberty covered the life of Solomon into the introduction to Jeroboam and Rehoboam, a real interesting time of Israel's history. It also covered Ecclesiastes and some of the Proverbs. So we'll be kind of mixing all of it. Of course, all of it ties in with Solomon, of course, because he was the author. A lot to say about him. And so I think Steve's going to start with some Proverbs. I'll do the book of Ecclesiastes, and then we'll talk some in general about uh, kings before we start talking more about Solomon. That seems to be kind of the general outline. We'll see if we're able to follow our own outline for today. So, Steve, why don't you start with whatever Proverbs you have?
Sure, I have Proverbs 27 through 31, and a lot could be said about these Proverbs, but I just wanted to point out a few highlights that kind of popped out to me uh, in Solomon's writings. And you know, we have we read in Proverbs 27:1 that Solomon says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth." And we've already talked about how the New Testament writers would grab onto some of these Old Testament passages and maybe even expand on them some. And so the Proverbs of the New Testaments, which we've already said, James could be compared to that in his writings, and how he seems to grab quite a bit of Solomon's Proverbs and incorporates them into his book. In James 4:13, tying to Proverbs 27:1, 4:13, James says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow." So here's the same thought. We will go to do such and such a city. We'll spend a year there and buy and sell and make a profit. And then he goes on to say in verse 14, whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. So again, he's expanding on Solomon's short thought and adding some description and some depth to it and some layers. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Verse 15 says, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance. James goes on to say, all such boasting is evil. And so again, James grabs that and expands on it. But also, I kind of wonder if that's what Jesus was thinking of on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, and specifically verse 34 in Matthew 6. So if you wanted to go there and read that, very similar about don't boast about tomorrow. You don't know what tomorrow holds. Worry about today. Tomorrow takes care of itself type idea. And then another one that kind of stood out to me is one we like to use in 27 of Proverbs, verse 17. As iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance. Or we can say a man sharpens or influences his friends. And so we like that when we're comparing verses when we're sitting around discussing Bible verses, and we're trying to come to some truths, better truths, maybe deeper and wider truths about the scriptures. Is iron sharpens iron, and that can be abrasive, that can put off sparks sometimes. But if we all keep in mind that it's trying to get to the truth together, and not who wins a debate, we're really trying to come to the full truth of a scripture or a thought in the scriptures. As iron sharpens iron is definitely an appropriate verse to use. Any thoughts on that verse, Rick, before we move on?
No, it's one man said one time, I was looking for light and all I got was heat. So when we discuss the Bible together, we're asking for light from one another. We're asking for others to shed light on what we've studied. But if it turns into responding with heat, then that causes problems. And it's really important to not change from wanting to shed light to giving heat, but often our flesh gets in the way and we do get heated, we do get personal, and it comes across as either attacking or condescending the other person's position. And that's real common. We've all done it. We've all had it done to us. But if we're really trying to sharpen each other, we can accept some sparks and realize that they're a brother in Christ and they're not trying to hurt us. But our flesh often overreacts with emotions, and our response is often kind of sharp rather than helpful. And so it's important to try to maintain a proper spirit when we're talking about things of the Bible, but we're so anxious sometimes to get our point across that it comes across as heat rather than light. That's a good verse.
Right, or it could even come across as condescending, because in the flesh at least I go to defense quicker than I would like to go when I hear a different opinion. But I'm working on that. 28 of Proverbs, I wasn't going to share any thoughts at this point, but in chapter 29, a pastor, Richard Harless, used often as we were growing up in the airport church. And 29 verse 18, where there is no vision. I'm going to read this one in a Old King James Version. Where there is no vision, the people perish, but he that keepeth the law, happy is he. So he would use this to try to encourage us, to try to have us moving forward, trying to think about the future, not getting stuck in the present. And I remember even as a young person, that was pretty inspiring when he would take a verse like this, as you've mentioned a few times, as he only could, and preach a whole message on it. Do you remember any of his thoughts on this that you want to share?
No, he'd
Okay.
he always wanted us to have a vision. He'd often say, a rut is just a grave with both ends kicked out. So he never wanted us to get into a rut. He wanted us to have a vision for the future and move forward, and it challenged us and it inspired us, and it was helpful to us the way he would handle these kind of verses.
Well, enough so to where, at my age in the late 60s, I still remember him bringing those verses out. So it was impactful and inspiring to us. In that Proverbs 31, so I'll skip 30 and just go to 31. It's a favorite of many, especially around special occasions such as Mother's Day and so forth. Or as I did at our mother's graveside service last year. It is used to speak of maybe the faithfulness of our mothers, the faithfulness of our wives, the faithfulness to those women of faith, even in the Bible or in our churches. And I think those are good ones to apply. So, verse 1, even though it doesn't say Samuel, some say verse 1 is referring to Solomon, not Samuel, to Solomon, and that he is revealing what his mother Bathsheba had taught him, or maybe what she tried to teach him. Don't know how well he was taught, or if he's declaring this as she tried to teach me and I didn't listen very well. Look at all the foreign wives and the concubines and that I married, and the heathen wives that are brought into the kingdom. So either way, it's chapter 31, especially the last half, are very good verses to apply to a variety of situations and a variety of individuals and even the corporate. So like 31 verse 10 says, who can find a virtuous woman, for her price is far above rubies? Well, we can definitely apply that to Christ and his church, and the cost, and he is going to have, and he is building and a virtuous woman. He is washing the garments white of the saints, who allows him to wash them with his word. And so, these verses could be applied to Christ and his church. And I think it wouldn't be wrong to do so. But at least when I used it at my mother's graveside service, my summary of our mother was in verse 28, and it's a favorite verse, but it's a verse that we 5 children definitely tried to express in my mother's life, towards the end of her life, and then even at her graveside service. Verse 28 of chapter 31 says, her children rise up and call her blessed, and we do. And her husband also, and my dad did. And he praises her. So we do this, and we did this, and we still do this, and we refer to my mother. But the benefits of having faithful parents are unmeasurable. And we've talked about this before as a family, just how beneficial that was to us. But on the other hand, the responsibility piece of we stand without excuse. We cannot blame our parents for our lack of faithfulness or our lack of service to the Lord, because we had great examples before us. So at this point, I was going to turn it over to you to cover Ecclesiastes if you have some thoughts.
Okay. No, you did a good job on those proverbs. Just Christ will present to himself a virtuous wife. He will marry her, and it will be a great union when he returns. I'm not going to say much about Ecclesiastes, maybe read a few verses, because I think it's one of those books you almost have to apply to your own life experience. We've all experienced what Solomon expressed of the vanity of life. And there's so much about this life that is vain or empty or worthless. And we probably spend too much of our time in things of vanity. But I think there's 2 key words or phrases found in Ecclesiastes that kind of sums it up. The phrase under the sun is used 30 times. So evidently Solomon means something specific, something important, by repeating that phrase under the sun. And I think the idea is that it's life without God, life under the sun, life on earth, life in the flesh, serving the flesh, not acknowledging the role of God in your life and the purpose of serving him and pleasing him. When you're just pleasing yourself, then that's the idea of under the sun. And that leads to the word vanity, which is used 37 times. So those two, that phrase and that word under the sun and vanity, is really the heart of what Solomon is trying to get across. He says in 2:10, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. Uh, he had all the money in the world, basically. He didn't lack finances. He didn't lack authority. He was the king. He didn't lack anything that would restrain him from going after and experiencing anything that the flesh nature desired. And it's such a good description in this book of concluding that the flesh nature can never be satisfied. Um, there were no limits. There was no prohibition. There was no speed bumps. There was nothing restricting him. Whatever came to his mind, he was able to experience. And yet he concludes it's all vanity. Did it really benefit him, especially in terms of eternity or his relationship with God? It actually worked the opposite. And so he, what we find toward the end of his life, especially, and we're going to see in Kings and Chronicles, that it specifically says when he was old, the women in his life, his wives and concubines, turned his heart to other gods. Well, he ruled for 40 years. He may have been as old as 20 when he started, so he died at 60. So here's Steve and I way past 60. And most days we don't consider ourselves old. There are days like last week when we got home from camp all week and driving home 400 miles, we may have felt our age. But most days we feel younger than our age. And so if he died at 60 and it says when he was old, he followed after other gods, it probably means from 50 on, maybe, let's say that. His last 10 years of his reign is when he really gave himself over to idolatry and those kind of things. And part of it was his curiosity. He was curious about everything, and whatever came to his mind, he experienced. So he allowed himself to experience the things of idolatry and the things of where his wives and concubines led him to, and he concluded it was all vanity. So we would say about Solomon, he had wisdom, but evidently he did not have maybe something as important as wisdom, and that's humility. And I think what we're going to find with the Queen of Sheba and so forth in our discussion today is that he allowed himself to believe what they were telling him, how great he was, how wonderful his people are, how beautiful his buildings are, how everything about him was so perfect. Well, he had people telling him that all the time for years. And without humility, you're going to start believing it. And in believing it, you're going to feel like you are indestructible, that you are above committing any grave sins because everyone's telling you how perfect and great you are. And wisdom without humility can lead to a downfall, because it did in Solomon. So evidently pride was the problem with him, not wisdom. And I think that help us understand. A lot of people say, well, if he was the wisest man of his day or ever, except for Christ, how could he go down that path away from God? Well, wisdom can only benefit if you have humility. And Paul said it another way in the New Testament: knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. So love is based in humility. Love is not based in pride. So knowledge puffs up. Now, that doesn't mean Paul didn't want us to be wise and knowledgeable. He got onto people several times. He'd say, I don't want you to be ignorant about this. And he always pressed people to know more, to learn more from the Bible about God. So he wasn't anti-knowledge, but knowledge without love. And I think that's kind of what Solomon ended up having, is wisdom without humility. And that was his downfall. Um, so Under the Sun and Vanity is what the whole book is based on. A lot of people misuse this book and read parts of it that says nothing better for man than to eat, drink, and be merry, basically. Um, but that's under the sun. That's life apart from God. It really is only enjoyment and pleasure of the flesh apart from God. And so he's not encouraging people to live that way. He's saying that without God as the center of your life, all you have is the pleasures of this life. And we see that all around us. That's how most people live their lives. Just a couple quick verses in 7:21 and 22. He says, also, do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. For many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. That is such a truism in life. We get so hurt when we find out what someone said about us. We take it so personal, and yet we downplay maybe some negative things we say about others and act like it's not really that big a deal. But when something is said about us that's negative, boy, it becomes really big. And Solomon gives good advice here is, people in their flesh are going to say negative things about others. So really don't take it to heart because you've kind of done the same thing. And don't build it up to where you're going to have a big falling out or, some sort of anger outburst because of it. Chapter 9 and verse 8, I really like this as far as when we're trying to apply Old Testament to the things of Christ and the things of the bride and the things of our service to him today. 9:8, let your garments always be white and let your head lack no oil. Well, it's a great, when you symbolize it or spiritualize it, of the white garments of the bride, the oil of the Holy Spirit, the anointing that goes along with being part of the bride. Uh, it just sums up a lot of what the New Testament is talking about to saints today. In 11:1 is a real good principle. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. That could be applied spiritually to the gospel. Spread the gospel far and wide, sow the seed, water it, and let God give the increase. So if you sow enough seed, if you spread the gospel, the bread of life, uh, enough, some of it's going to come back to you in the form of conversions. But it could also just be a general principle of be generous. Just cast your bread, give what you have to a lot of people. Be generous of spirit, be generous of your finances and so forth as you go through life. And a generous soul, Proverbs, several verses talks about this. The generous soul shall be watered, that is going to come back to you as blessings if you're generous that way. As Proverbs 11:25 says that. And then we'll just close Ecclesiastes with reading what Solomon concluded, the end of this. 12:9. Moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was upright, words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and the words of scholars are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. Further, my son, be admonished by these, of making many books there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh, but it is beneficial. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. And you talked about James in his book in the New Testament seem to refer to Solomon's writings a lot. And I think would probably say if Solomon really had his downfall in the last, say, 10 years of his life, so 30 years was pretty good spiritual shape, I'd say that much of his written material was during that time. And so, someone might say, why would God include so much of Solomon's writings? And why would New Testament writers refer to his writings so much when he became such an ungodly man. But that's why Kings and Chronicles says when he was old. So we're talking about the last part of his life, and maybe the more positive, spiritually beneficial things that he wrote was while he was still in pretty decent shape with the Lord. So be that as it may, or leave it with you to think about that. Maybe agree or disagree with that. You have anything to say about Ecclesiastes before you talk about the kings?
And there's, you know, probably like you do, that like we have in Proverbs too, we have a lot of things underlined in these books in your Bibles, and I do too. And you know, as you were talking about James grabbing onto some of these, I'm glancing through here. It seems like most of that I have underlined. We can find a reference to that in the New Testament, and so, you know, through these studies, through reading through the Bible series, and especially now when we eventually in the second half we're going to get to the New Testament, and just within a few months here, maybe in 3 months, we're going to probably remember some of these things what we read and bring it up again for our sakes and for the hearers' sake. So no added comments to what you said then at this point.
Okay. So you want to talk about the kings?
Yeah, I do want to talk about the kings just a minute. I went back and I was reminded of some things about kings. So we're going to be going through in our readings this week the first two kings after the split, the first two kings of Judah, and at least the first few in Israel when we conclude our reading this week. You know, we have some good kings. We have some extremely evil kings. But it helped me to go back and remember what we discussed many months ago when we were going through the book of Deuteronomy. So I just want to read this, a few verses, and keep in the back of our mind these verses when we consider the various kings over Judah and over Israel. So before we talk about those multiple kings in our readings, I want to remind us what Moses said in Deuteronomy and the principles around governing kings. And as I read some of these verses, we can already think about the few kings that we're covering. And because we're about a week ahead in our reading of what we're covering today, some of these thoughts in what I'm going to read in Deuteronomy definitely apply to some of the kings that we're going to talk about in the next session, for sure. So I wonder how many of these kings violated what Moses said and about the expectations laid out by the Lord. The Lord laid them out, Moses spoke them. So in Deuteronomy 17, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you and possess it and dwell in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like the nations all around me. So we see that happening in our readings now, some appointed by the Lord, it appears, and some rising up themselves. Verse 15 of Deuteronomy 17 says, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. Well, some of that was being violated. One from among your brethren you shall set as a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother, but he shall not multiply for himself horses, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, for the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way. So now we're moving into some of the thoughts I want us to remember as we go through. Neither shall he multiply for himself wives. We're seeing that under Solomon and Solomon's son after him. Lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. So, enrich his kingdom, maybe one thing enriching himself, maybe another. It shall be So here's the key. When he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall, so the new king, as soon as he, in his inauguration process, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priest. So he's supposed to do that with the priest, so the priest could help him understand what he's writing, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and to be careful to observe the words of the law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. So when I read those verses again, it reminded me of what a king is, the expectations of a king in the eyes of God, spoken through Moses. It seemed like, man, when I was in our reading the last 2 weeks, it really has popped out. Well, that's a violation. Well, that's a violation. Well, that's a violation. And so I kind of wanted to bring that out before we move into the kings here, and kind of keep that in the back of our mind as we consider some of these kings. So I think you're going to start covering 1 Kings 10 through 11 at this point.
It's interesting you bring that up. There's two different ways of looking at that statement that Israel made, give us a king like the other nations. What it should have meant, or could have meant in a better light, is we don't want our king to be like the other kings, but we do want a king like the other nations have kings. But instead, what we're finding out is the other way of looking at that phrase. Many of their kings were like the kings of other nations in character and practice. So that one little phrase could mean all the difference in the world. Unfortunately, many of Israel's kings, especially the northern kingdom after they split, pretty much all of them became like kings of other nations. At least Judah had some pretty godly kings, some who were not, but some who were. And Solomon maybe is a picture of all of the kings as a whole, because he was some of both. He was a godly man, and then he was an ungodly man. So he kind of pictures all the kings in one person. But my part is 1 Kings 10 and 11, also 2 Chronicles 9 and 10, which is kind of a repeat of what King says. And as you read in 1 Kings 9, which is how great Solomon was, the blessings of his kingdom, and the Queen of Sheba, and all the different things she had to say. For instance, in chapter 10, verses 5 through 7, starting in verse 4, and when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. And she said to the king, it was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw it with my own eyes. And indeed, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard. Now, this was true, but Solomon ended up, as it goes on to say, that many other kings and rulers from other nations paid their way, basically, to come see Solomon, meet him in person, hear of his wisdom. And I imagine all of them said about the same things that the Queen of Sheba said. So Solomon is hearing this year after year after year, how great he is, how wonderful his kingdom is, how blessed he is. and that I really think that fed into his pride and led to his downfall. Um, because sometimes, even if something is true about another person, if they hear it enough, it feeds into their pride and they start believing it in the flesh rather than in the spirit. But the other thing I'd say about this reading that I read is that we're trying always at Liberty to look for Christ everywhere, especially in the Old Testament. And if you're looking for him, you will find him. And this whole description of his wisdom, how happy his people are, the half has not been told, uh, your wisdom, verse 8, how happy are your men, happy are your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. If we start applying that to Christ when he returns, sets up his kingdom on the earth, rules for 1,000 years, uh, what we find in this description is used about Christ in several other Old Testament passages. For instance, Psalm 72, written by Solomon himself, and I think before his heart turned away from God, these things described about him, he enlarged them, as David often did, to not just himself, but the greater eternal king that would eventually come from the bloodline and rule on David's throne forever. We call him the Messiah, Christ. So in Psalm 72, a psalm written by Solomon, it's obvious as you start reading down through it uh, that it's really talking about, for instance, in verse 7, in his days the righteous shall flourish in abundance of peace until the moon is no more. We're talking about an extended period of time, not just 40 years. He shall have dominion also from sea to sea. Well, I guess if you make it the Mediterranean Sea to the Sea of Galilee, then you could apply it to Solomon. But I think the idea here, he's talking about the whole world. And from the river to the ends of the earth. So much larger than the kingdom of David and Solomon. He's picturing here uh, the king that was promised to David, uh, that would be much, that would be without end, uh, and not uh, stopped by death. Those who dwell in the wilderness will bow before him, and his enemies shall lick the dust. Then here's where it really applies to what we read about the Queen of Sheba. The kings of Tarshish and all of the isles will bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba will offer gifts. Yes, all kings shall fall down before him. All nations shall serve him. Well, to a smaller degree, that was the experience of Solomon. He did have people coming to him from all over the known earth and say great things about him. But this is obviously enlarged to be much more than just a human king who would live and die and someone would take his place. And it goes on to say, uh, down in verse 15, he shall live, and the gold of Sheba will be given to him. Prayer also will be made for him continually. Well, that's kind of neat to think about prayer being said about him and to him when Christ rules in his kingdom. And daily he shall be praised. And of course, the difference is great things will be said about the king in the millennial, but it won't go to his head. It won't feed his pride because he's the perfect example of humility. So it will not lead to his downfall. It will be the truth without it doing any harm. And it just goes on, verse 17, his name shall endure forever. His name shall continue as long as the sun. Men shall be blessed in him, and all nations shall call him blessed. So it's obviously a psalm written by Solomon about someone beyond Solomon, about the Christ. And then we go to a passage, even the later prophets, Isaiah chapter 60 says much the same thing. So we're talking about, 300 to 400 years after Solomon. In Isaiah chapter 60, and I'll just read a few verses for sake of time. Isaiah chapter 60, you start reading down through that chapter, and it becomes obvious that it's talking about Christ. And it says in verse 6, 60, verse 6. No, let me back up. I'm sorry. I want to read verses 3 through 7. The Gentiles shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Those are just beautiful terms speaking about Christ. Lift up your eyes all around and see. They all gather together. They come to you. Your son shall come from afar. Your daughter shall be nursed at your side. Then shall that you shall see and become radiant, and your heart will swell with joy. Because of the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the Gentiles shall come to you. The multitude of camels shall cover your land. The dromedaries of Midian and Ephah and all those from Sheba. There's that Sheba again. I think all these later writers are drawing from the experience of the Queen of Sheba and then applying it to Christ on a worldwide scale. They shall bring gold and incense. They shall proclaim the praises of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered together to you. The rams of Nebaioth shall minister you. They shall ascend and with acceptance on my altar, and I will glorify the house of my glory. And this whole chapter of Isaiah is talking about uh, about Christ. For instance, verse 16: You shall drink the milk of the Gentiles and milk the breast of kings. You shall know that I, the Lord, am your Savior and your Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob. So this story we love to talk about of the Queen of Sheba's praise of Solomon is going to be enlarged to the entire earth at the return of Christ, and everyone is going to bow down to him and praise him, and it will not affect him spiritually in a negative way at all. Uh, Let me see. What else do I want to say about that? I think there's enough about that. It after all the praise, and it talks about his great wealth at the end of chapter 10. It's amazing how much wealth that he had. Stables, horses, chariots, and everything of gold, and just quite amazing. Uh, the wealth and the fame and the praise that came to him. But I like what chapter 11, how it starts out. But, so something's about to change. But, so it mentions his marriages to women of other nations. You had read in Moses' writings what the end of verse 2 says. You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. And these were women who were married to him and his concubines. And you could say, well, it's their fault. But God places the blame on Solomon, not on the women. Um, there's a lot to be said about rich and powerful men are easily brought down by woman trouble. That's such a common theme in history. It's such a common theme in politics today. The scandals that we hear about, and probably the many more scandals that we have not heard about, men allowing the women in their life to pretty much ruin their careers, cause them to do stupid things. That's such a common theme that seems to take place over and over. And it says at the end of verse 3 that these 1,000 women turned away his heart. So it says in verse 4, so it was so when Solomon was old. I kind of hate to read that part of the verse, because if he died when he was 60, then it's basically saying probably when he was 50, he was old. Steve and I are about 20 years older than that. And we don't consider looking back when we were 50 now as being old, but When he was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. His heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as with the heart of his father David. And it goes on to talk about the idolatry that he began to practice, and that caused his downfall. And Chronicles says much the same thing. Second Chronicles 9 and 10, and this leads to the introduction in 1 Kings 11:26 of this man Jeroboam, and what all happened that led to the split of the kingdom. But Steve has more of that in his assignment than I do. Covers a large part of his, so I think I'll just leave that up to Steve to cover. But the death of Solomon, down in verse 41 through 43, his rule was 40 years, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. And all the things that happened in the time of Rehoboam and Jeroboam is more in Steve's reading. So I think I'll just stop right there and let you take over.
Well, thank you for tying 1 Kings 10 into Psalm 72. I think we've tied it before into Isaiah 60, but I hadn't. Psalm 72 seems to hit the nail on the head for sure. So, as Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam is his replacement, so he's made king after his father dies. And then one of David's servants, a few years before, Jeroboam, who had fled to Egypt because Solomon, he had some issues with Solomon, and Solomon maybe saw him as a threat, maybe even a threat to his son Rehoboam, and he fled to Egypt. He was an Ephraimite. Jeroboam was an Ephraimite, and so the more of the northern part of Israel. After Rehoboam was made king, Jeroboam was then sent for. So some saw this as the opportunity to, hey, let's get Jeroboam back here. We respect his leadership, or we like the way that he was wanting to lead the people, or to encourage the people, or rally the people. So they sent for him, and he came back. So him and others came then to Rehoboam. So it's still a united kingdom at this part, but not really united. There was already a bunch of undercurrents. And this is the story where they said, your father, so Solomon, made our yoke heavy. And he did, but he built up and established a kingdom, built a temple, built other buildings, built houses. Gold was plentiful. Silver was as common as can be. But now that was over, and they're telling him, hey, that's over. Now therefore lighten the burden service that your father had placed upon us, and his heavy yoke which he put on us. So that's in the 12th chapter of 1 Kings. We read this. So we know that he consulted with two groups of advisors, those that were in Solomon's rule or kingdom, those who had advised Solomon, and those of his young friends who grew up with him and probably were beneficiaries, or they lived a privileged life with Rehoboam. And so he chose what they recommended, and he decides that he will not lower taxes, but he will raise them to the point of suffering and pain and hardship for the people. The older advisors had said, no, you speak well to them, listen to them. Maybe even the inference there is to lessen their taxes, and they'll be yours. They'll follow you your entire life. Well, he didn't listen to this, and it backfires in chapter 12. And back in 12 verse 15, so the king did not listen to the people And here's one that we kind of got to reconcile in our minds. For the turn of the events was from the Lord. That's in chapter 12, verse 15. That he might fulfill his word, which the Lord has spoken to Ahijah, the Shilonite, to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Maybe this is one of those ones that we've concluded multiple times in our reading so far that, the Lord wasn't necessarily in the details, so how that was going to work out. His overall will is going to be accomplished, but how that's worked out, there's a variety of ways. Just the evilness of him knowing what was in man's hearts could play out and cause that to happen. Or could we say that these events were from the Lord because that prophecy had to be fulfilled by the prophet that was sent to Jeroboam, not in order that the Lord would make it happen, but the Lord knew it was going to happen, so he prophesied. He had that prophet speak to Jeroboam, and it's got to come to pass because the Lord told the prophet to tell him that. So, some things, some different avenues or different viewpoints could be expressed on whether it was the Lord's causing the details, or if the Lord spoke it because he knew, and then the details would be hammered out because men in the flesh are in the flesh and it's going to happen. So the outcome was now that, Rehoboam wants to raise taxes. The northern tribes said, it looks like we don't have any part in David anymore. And they took off back north to their homes. And now Rehoboam, who is going to raise taxes and is going to receive considerably less revenue. So it backfires. And you spoke before about, and I believe it's true, just in life that we live, that there's a certain point to where, we're living in a time to where the taxes we paid don't seem fair, but we still get up every day and do the right thing. But there's a certain point that, no, we're not going to do that. And it leads to rebellion. So he thought he was going to raise taxes, increase revenue. He still didn't get it when the northern tribes said, we're not going to do that, because Rehoboam goes ahead and sends out his tax collector, and they just kill him. And then that's when Rehoboam kind of realizes, I better run back to Jerusalem and be safe. So he's going to receive considerably less when his advisors maybe spoke about how, man, we thought we had a good life before. Now it's going to it's not going to come to fruition. But I did want to remind us, and you read in chapter 10 down through verse 7, I think. Maybe you read this verse 2 and I missed it. The Queen of Sheba says in 10 verse 8, I want to remind them, how happy are your men and happy are these your servants? So under Solomon, again, just a contrast I'm wanting to point out here. The contrast of under Solomon, even though taxes were high, the servanthood was demanding, but happy are your servants. Now there's this big split, there's turmoil, everything's turned upside down, people are running for their lives, people are rebelling. What a difference in a pretty short time between Solomon's reign and his son's reign. So it's all turned upside down. Now, some of this story in 2 Chronicles that goes along with 1 Kings 12, in 2 Chronicles, it does add a little bit of information. It does tell us in 2 Chronicles 11, 13 through 17, it says, even though there was now going to be an establishment of 10 northern kingdoms, Jeroboam reigning over those, that he starts setting up other places of worship. And he uses the excuse about if they head back to Jerusalem to worship, they may defect back to Rehoboam. And so he sets up these other places of worship, other altars. It does say in 2 Chronicles 11 that the priest and the Levites moved to Judah. In fact, I'm starting with verse 13. It says, and from all their territories, the priests and the Levites who were in all of Israel took their stand with him, for the Levites left their common lands and their possessions. And that's a big deal. They're taking what is theirs. They're moving their homes, their families. They took their possessions and came to Judah and Jerusalem. For Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them from serving as priests to the Lord. Then he appointed for himself priests in high places, that is, Jeroboam in the northern tribes, for the demons and for the calf idols which he had made. And after the Levites left, so there's no more Levites left in the northern tribes, or if there is some, they're very few and scattered apart, maybe just a few prophets left. We could say, those from all the tribes of Israel, such as set their hearts, and this I have this underlined, such as set their hearts to seek the Lord God of Israel, came to Jerusalem to sacrifice to the Lord God of their fathers. So they strengthened the kingdom of Judah and made Rehoboam the son of Solomon strong for 3 years, because they walked in the way of David and Solomon for 3 years. So this is a really big deal. This is, again, such a turning point from, you had King David with the United Kingdom, people loving to come and worship, and then Solomon building the temple and that whole celebration, and the people just with joy and gladness are coming to worship a United Kingdom. And now, such a short time after this, things are in turmoil. The Levites are leaving the northern 10 tribes and coming down to Judah. Others that are seeking to do the Lord's will and wanting to serve him are defecting, losing their lands, losing their inheritance, but it was worth it to come to Judah and to get away from the northern tribes. So before I move on, you have any thoughts up to this point?
You've stirred up several good thoughts. One would be, it's interesting that Jeroboam was from Ephraim, because there's always been this undercurrent of rivalry and strife between Ephraim and Judah. And it's partly because the birthright blessings was divided between them. Ephraim got the main part of it, but Judah got the rulership, which is a pretty big part of it. It seemed like they were always kind of in conflict with each other. So the question might be asked, why did God set the nation up this way with their separate tribes, their land inheritance, so that even camping around the tabernacle on their journey, he made each tribe stay among themselves with their own banners. So this tribal identity within the larger nation often produced conflict between the tribes toward each other. So the question might be asked, why did God set it up this way if it was going to lead those kind of problems? But that's just the thing. God set it up that way to test them, whether they'd be able to overcome those kind of natural conflicts and unite together as a single nation. It's kind of like, why does God set up the church the way he did? Why did God set up the family the way he did? Well, part of it is the different roles we are to have within the church or within the family is a test of whether we will submit to God's ways and still find a way to work together in love and harmony in spite of the things that would lead to natural conflict. And so God designed Israel in a way that was supposed to produce spiritual qualities that would overcome the flesh nature's likeliness of rivalry and conflict among tribes, and especially seen in Ephraim and in Judah. So that's a real interesting path to look into, of God purposely setting things up within his institutions that would lead to human conflict, and that God did it uh, for the reason of, are we able to rise above that in God's grace, love, and forgiveness, and all the fruit of the Spirit qualities we need to avoid the natural conflicts. As I've often said about serving the Lord, the hardest thing about serving the Lord is the design that we have to do it with other people. Well, that sets up a test. Are we able to uh, not allow the natural conflicts of different personalities, different things about us that would lead to clashes? Are we able to rise above that by God's grace? So it's actually for our growth, and yet it makes it kind of difficult in the flesh. So that's kind of one thought you brought up. And the other thought is, um, I forget right now. So you just keep talking and it'll come back to me.
Okay. Well, Jeroboam is, we can compare him to, false religion today for sure. There was a way, there was a truth, and there's a manner and a method by which to serve God. And Jeroboam ignored all of those. In fact, you could say, and I think you spoke about this before, Jeroboam and the others came to Rehoboam asking to be reasonable. He offended them, and now they established their kingdom. Jeroboam established his household, his rulership, set up all these altars, these alternative places to offer sacrifices, which were not the way that Moses had instructed them, or not how Moses had instructed them to conduct their worship. And so you've mentioned before, and this seems to be true in this case, that the original offended one now becomes a larger offender. On the surface, Jeroboam seems like, well, he's reasonable. He wants less taxes. It seems like he would be willing to yield if Rehoboam was reasonable. Well, now his real true colors come out, apparently. And, when you have all the Levites and the priests and those that want to seek after God's will leaving the country, and it's only left with a bunch of ruthless, self-religious, false religious, man-made religion established in an area, man, it gets pretty goofy. And we can easily apply some of that today to our time and the extreme false religions that are around us, and those that will say, we are serving the same God and we read the same Bible as you do, yet their practices are so contrary to what the Word of God says. And we'll hear things like, well, God will accept it. God's a generous spirit. He's a forgiving person. He's a forgiving God. He'll accept us because of our efforts. All these things that we can say. Well, these passages leave no doubt about how God was upset about what was going on in the northern territories. But lest we just blame it on the northern territories and see how far they went, we'll read a few verses in a minute to see how far the southern kingdom went also. They were at this point, maybe not much better, even though they had the priest, they had those that were wanting to serve the Lord. Apparently, that was somewhat a remnant during Rehoboam's last part of his reign, at least. So we'll read some verses here to kind of indicate some of that. So in 1 Kings 13, we see to where a man of God was sent to Jeroboam, so in the northern territories, and he gave him a message from God. That message did not sit well with Jeroboam. So Jeroboam tried to have him arrested. So I'm just kind of summarizing here for time's sake. And asked the man of God to pray for him, and his hand was restored. Then in 13:7, the king said to the man of God, "Come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward." But the man of God said in 13:8, the man of God said to the king, "If you were to give me half your house," well, this isn't a shack that the king has. This is the king over the northern 10 tribes. But anyway, that's kind of a side point. But I just wonder, as to kind of think about for a second what he's saying. If you were to give me half your house, I would not go with you, nor would I eat bread or drink water in this place. For so it was commanded me by the word of the Lord, saying, you shall not eat bread nor drink water, nor return by the way that you came. Then it moves into the kind of that strange story about the prophet. This prophet who said this now eventually disobeying exactly what he stated. There was some lying done from an older prophet that maybe the younger prophet assumed, well, he's older and he's wiser. And if he says, I can stay here a while and eat and drink, maybe he knows more than me, but nevertheless, the old prophet states that, well, I was told that you need to come follow me. So it's kind of a strange story that ends in that first prophet being killed by a lion but not eaten. So that's strange. A lion, I don't think, kills just for the fun of it. He kills to eat. And so this lion apparently obeys the Lord's command and has and kills this prophet. But he's standing there with the donkey, and they're standing side by side. And the old prophet hears about it and goes and buries him in his own tomb. But even after all of this, Rehoboam did not turn from his evil way. But again, he made priests in every places from every class of people. I want to be a priest. You can be a priest. Well, I'm also a thief, but you can be a priest. From just the scoundrels and so forth. So he broke every. He seemed to break most of the boundaries and the rules by which the Lord had established on who a priest would be, how they would serve, and the method they would serve, and where they would serve, and where they would offer sacrifices. So he continues down this path. So it leads to his downfall. Verse 34 of 1 Kings 13 says, and this thing was a sin of the house of Jeroboam, so as to exterminate and to destroy, or the NIV says it led to his downfall and to its destruction. And it was from the face of the earth. So Jeroboam continues to go downhill. It continues to deny the correct way to serve the Lord, even when a prophet is sent to him, and then dies. And before he dies, he loses his son, and that's chapter 14. And he gets his wife involved to go inquire from a man of God, and that man of God, again summarizing, I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you in chapter 14, and yet you have not been as my servant David, who kept my commandments and who follow me. So we're down to verse 9 in chapter 14. But You have done more evil than all who were before you, and you have gone and made yourself other gods and molten images to prove me to anger. So again, not many years after Solomon's gone, just two generations from David, we could say, and how far the northern kingdoms had gone, and the southern kingdom wasn't much behind them. And have cast me behind your back. Verse 10, therefore, behold, I will bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam, and I will cut off from Jeroboam every male in Israel, bond and free, and I will take away the remnant of the house of Jeroboam as one who takes away refuge until it's all gone, refuse until it's all gone. So, you know, at the end of chapter 14, we read where Judah was doing evil in the sight of the Lord and provoked him to jealousy, which they committed. And so again, not much difference. Where early on, maybe there was some differences, but as time went on, you know, one was not much different than the other. And again, only two generations from a united kingdom ruled under David, a type of Christ, Solomon, a king under great prosperity and joyful service and joy to serve in the kingdom. And now it's just, can you imagine being a righteous person in Judah and Israel at this time and having to live under these conditions? But there were some. The Lord always had a remnant, and there were always some that would not turn from serving the Lord correctly. So that's my part I wanted to cover today. You have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I remembered what I had forgotten earlier. That part in 1 Kings 12 and 15, when you said, but the turn of the affairs was from God. And that's always, there's a number of examples of this in the Bible. And we seek to try to understand it and explain it. And I think the principle of a lot of these can be best explained by the death of Christ, where it's very clear that it was as Peter said on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2 and 23, that it was he was delivered by the determinate counsel of God, that it was God's plan all along. Christ was going to die. It was necessary for him to die. He guided the whole thing. And yet that did not disqualify or remove the guilt of those who killed him. They still had murder in their heart. They hated him. They plotted. They schemed. They acted as if it was all under their control, but God was controlling the whole thing. And it's this side by side, God's sovereign will and our free will operating side by side. We don't understand the exact way that both of them can work together side by side to reach the same conclusion. But that's the wisdom of God. And so they're still accused in the early chapters of Acts of murdering the Prince of Life. Well, they were guilty of murder, but it was still Christ who gave his life, and it was the Father who willed it to be done. And but it did not remove the guilt of the people. So I think a lot of things in the Bible, like this division of the tribes of the nation, that it did not violate the free will of Rehoboam and Jeroboam acting out their own plans and will, and yet God was working in it, as God often works in normal events of human nature, to bring about his will. And again, we don't quite understand how both of those can work together at the same time. But I think the death of Christ helps us to understand that a little bit better than any other example. The only other thing I'd bring up is that you had read where the Levites, the priests and the Levites, came down from the northern tribes, left their land and property and everything because of what Jeroboam was doing. That is the first of several migrations of godly people from the north coming to the south. And it answers a lot of questions, like people like to talk about the lost tribes of Israel and how northern 10 tribes were taken into Assyrian captivity and scattered all over the earth and were lost to history. And yet people from all of the northern tribes migrated down to Judah. And so Judah really became the melting pot of the godly of all the tribes. So the 10 northern tribes were represented in the southern kingdom, and willing to leave their lands and properties behind because they were a godly remnant and realized that they needed to go to where at least God was still represented to some degree in the priesthood and the temple and a number of godly kings, whereas the north didn't have much of any of that. So we're going to read in our next couple of sessions, we're going to be finding other migrations of people from the north down to the south. So keep that in mind as we move along through the kings and dealing with both the northern and the southern kingdoms. It gets pretty confusing, the names, some are similar and going back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes the kings of Judah align themselves through marriage with the kings of the northern. And so it gets pretty messy. But somehow God was able to keep them separate and made sure that the bloodline promises given to David and to Abraham were continued all the way down through their various times of rebellion and ungodliness and all the messes that they had. God was able to preserve those bloodline promises all the way to Christ. That's my part. Anything you have to say in conclusion?
No, very good. But you said something for us to look forward to, and that is look for those migrations when we read in our next couple sessions, and for me to keep in mind what I brought up about the qualifications or the standards set for a king who's going to rule over you, and I'll be looking for those times that they violated those expectations from the Lord. So that's what I have today.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Session 25 comes to a close. And in a few days, Steve and I are going to do session 26, which would normally have been today. So we'll catch up and we'll share some other good things. There's so many good things. We're just kind of hitting some of the highlights, but hopefully we say things along the way that maybe you haven't thought of before, or refresh your memory, or helps you in developing your own lessons and sermons and devotionals wherever you are, that we might trigger some good thoughts. That's our primary goal, is to help you along your walk with the Lord in a positive way. So may God bless all of you, and we conclude this session.